There's a kind of discomfort we can't quite name, you know? It's not exactly sadness, not depression in the clinical sense, not just loneliness. It's something deeper, something older, like we're in a place that's technically ours, but never really felt like home. You look around, see people living their lives, seemingly comfortable with all of it, and you wonder why you can't. Why, even surrounded by people, you feel like you're speaking a language nobody else understands. Why life goes on normally for everyone else, while you have this persistent feeling of watching everything from behind glass. Maybe this feeling isn't a defect, but a calling. Maybe the soul is trying to tell you something the world doesn't want to hear. And maybe, just maybe, the biggest mistake you can make is trying to silence that voice that keeps reminding you that something, somewhere deep down, isn't fitting right. Have you ever noticed how, since childhood, some people always seem a little out of place? Not in an obvious way, not necessarily shy or antisocial, but with that subtle feeling of watching life from the outside, like there's a separation between you and the rest of the world. And the curious thing is that many people learn to disguise this so well that they even forget they're disguising it. The truth is, in childhood, we start to notice that certain parts of us are too much. Too sensitive, too intense, too strange, too much of a dreamer. That kid who cried watching the sunset, who asked difficult questions about death before turning 7, who preferred staying alone inventing worlds rather than playing with others at the park. And then the process of silent amputation begins. Because the world has no patience for those who don't fit into ready-made boxes. Adults smile uncomfortably when you say things that are too profound. Classmates look at you weird when you don't laugh at the same jokes. And gradually you learn the language of camouflage. You learn to laugh when others laugh, to be interested in what others are interested in, to pretend that superficial conversation about nothing satisfies you as much as it seems to satisfy everyone else. And the saddest part is that this process is so gradual, so subtle, that you don't even notice when you stop being yourself. There are people who spend their entire lives carrying the weight of this forced adaptation, wondering why they never feel at home, without realizing that the real home was abandoned back there, when we were still small and learned that being authentic was too dangerous. Without realizing that each time you denied a part of yourself to be accepted, you were closing one more door to your own inner dwelling. And now, decades later, you look back and barely recognize the way home. And when you grow up in this scheme, in this constant negotiation between what you are and what they expect you to be, something happens. You build a version of yourself that works in the world, a persona, as Jung would say. A social mask that's polite, that knows how to answer the right questions, that performs competence, that smiles at appropriate times, that says exactly what needs to be said to keep things flowing without friction. And there's nothing wrong with that necessarily. We need masks to survive in social interaction. It's impossible to be completely transparent all the time with everyone. The problem is when you spend so much time wearing the mask that you forget you're wearing it. When the persona stops being a tool and becomes the only identity you know. When you wake up in the morning and you're already performing before even getting out of bed. When every interaction, even with the closest people, feels like a carefully rehearsed performance. Because then, my friend, you become a stranger to yourself. You wake up one day, look in the mirror, and don't quite recognize who's looking back at you. You see someone competent, maybe even successful in the eyes of the world. But inside there's an enormous void, an absence that can't be filled with external achievements. And then comes that anguishing feeling of not belonging anywhere, because you don't even belong to yourself. How are you going to feel at home in the world if you don't feel at home inside your own skin? How are you going to recognize a true home if you've completely lost touch with who you really are? We live in a culture that values very specific things. Productivity, efficiency, control, rationality, visible achievements, measurable results. If you're not building something, reaching some goal, climbing some ladder, you're wasting time. And look, I'm not saying these things are bad in themselves. They have their place, they have their usefulness. But the problem is that the soul doesn't operate on that frequency. The soul doesn't care about your LinkedIn, about how many zeros are in your bank account, about how many people follow you on social media. The soul speaks through symbols, through silences, through intuitions that don't fit in spreadsheets. The soul needs empty time, contemplation, moments when absolutely nothing is happening, and that's okay. The soul needs space to breathe, to expand, to simply exist without a defined purpose. And the modern world is terrified of emptiness. We fill every second with stimuli, with notifications, with production, with constant movement. You grab your phone as soon as you wake up, consume information while eating, listen to podcasts while exercising, work while watching series, sleep with the TV on. When was the last time you spent a whole hour without any external stimulus? When was the last time you sat at a window and simply looked outside without thinking about anything specific, without solving any problem, without planning anything? And when you try to see yourself in this cultural mirror, when you try to recognize yourself in the values everyone repeats, you feel deformed. Because you're trying to translate the language of the soul into the language of the ego, and something always gets lost in that translation. It's like trying to explain a symphony using only numbers. Technically, you can even measure frequencies, durations, amplitudes, but the essence escapes through your fingers. What gives you chills when you hear that music can't be quantified? And that's exactly what the world asks you to do with your own existence, to transform everything into data, into metrics, into tangible results. And the soul withers in this process. It shrinks, retracts, becomes more and more distant. And you know what happens when you spend too much time trying to fit into a mold that wasn't made for you? When you force adaptation too much, when you deny who you are too much, you collapse. Not necessarily a dramatic collapse, with screaming and hospitalizations, although that happens too. Sometimes it's a silent collapse. The anxiety that doesn't go away anymore, that becomes a constant companion. The insomnia that becomes routine. Those 3 a.m. moments staring at the ceiling wondering if this is really all there is. That persistent feeling that nothing makes sense, that you're fulfilling all the expected rituals, going to work, paying bills, keeping up appearances, but nothing really touches you. You're functioning but not living. You're operating but not feeling. And there are days when you don't know if you can take one more day doing this. But you also don't know how to do anything else because you've completely lost touch with what truly living would be. The ancient alchemists had a name for this state. They called it nigredo, the black phase of transformation. It was the moment when all matter dissolved, when everything that seemed solid melted into a shapeless darkness. It was the stage of chaos, putrefaction, symbolic death. And you know what's fascinating about nigredo? It wasn't seen as an error or a failure. It wasn't seen as something that should be avoided or fixed quickly. It was seen as absolutely necessary, as the obligatory first step of the great alchemical work. Because only when the ego dissolves, when false structures crumble, when everything you built based on external expectations turns to dust, is when something true can begin to emerge. The house where you lived, made of borrowed beliefs, invented characters, social roles you accepted without questioning, that house needs to collapse. And when it collapses, you feel like you're losing everything. You feel like you're going crazy, that you're failing, that you're going in the wrong direction while everyone else continues firmly on the right path. But maybe you're just, finally, making space for something real. Maybe the collapse is the beginning, not the end. There's a part of you that was left in the dark a long time ago. Jung called this the shadow. And the word scares us, right? We think of the shadow as something bad, something dangerous that should be kept locked in the basement of the psyche. The shadow is where the monster lives, where violent impulses stay, obscene desires, everything that shames us. But the truth is much more interesting and much more complex than that. The shadow isn't the pure evil that lives in you. The shadow is everything you had to deny to be accepted. It's everything that didn't fit the image you needed to project. And here's the part many people don't understand. The shadow doesn't only contain bad things. There's the artistic talent you hid because it wasn't practical, because art doesn't pay the bills. There's the sensitivity you suffocated because men don't cry, because women can't be too fragile. There's the legitimate anger you swallowed for years because you had to be the understanding person, the person who doesn't make drama, the person who keeps the peace at any cost. There's the deep desire you locked away because it didn't fit the script they chose for you, because it would scare people, because it would make you inconvenient. And here's the kicker. The shadow doesn't just guard what's difficult in you, it also guards treasures. Living, potent, creative parts of your soul, that were exiled along with what was unacceptable. When you start looking at the shadow without terror, when you allow it to rise to the surface and be seen, when you have the courage to recognize that those denied parts are also yours, something magical happens. You start becoming whole again. You recover energy that was being spent on repressing, on hiding, on keeping everything locked up. And the more whole you become, the less of a stranger you feel. Because you're rescuing pieces of yourself you thought you'd lost forever. You're undoing that old amputation. You're coming back home, piece by piece. And you know where else the soul tries to speak to you, where it sends messages almost every night, in dreams. Do you pay attention to your dreams, or are you one of those who wakes up and forgets everything in 5 minutes, as if dreams were just random noise from the brain processing the day's information? Because dreams aren't mental garbage. Dreams aren't just synapses firing randomly while you sleep. Dreams are letters the unconscious sends you, written in a language that doesn't obey the logic of day, but the logic of the soul. There are places you visit in dreams that never existed in real life, but that seem more familiar than your own house. You enter that room, that garden, that dreamlike city, and you have an immediate sense of recognition, as if you'd been there before, as if that place belonged to you in some deep way. There are people who appear disguised, who aren't who they seem to be, but who carry important messages. Absurd situations that don't make logical sense but carry immense emotional weight. You wake up with your heart racing, with tears on your face, with a feeling that something important happened, even if you don't know exactly what. Jung spent hours studying dreams, his own and his patient's, because he knew that's where a conversation was happening between the conscious and unconscious. A desperate attempt by the psyche to restore some balance that was lost during the day. When you completely ignore a part of yourself in waking life, it will appear distorted in nighttime dreams. When you deny an emotion, it will come back symbolized in images that haunt you. And when you start paying attention, when you start writing down these dreams as soon as you wake up, when you start making connections between nighttime images and your daytime life, you're deciphering an ancient language. A language that's always been available but that you learned to ignore. And this language takes you back home, to the inner home you abandoned without realizing it. At the center of all this, in the middle of this journey of exile and return, in the eye of the psychic hurricane, there's something Jung called the self. And no, it's not your ego, it's not your social personality, it's not the sum of your roles, it's not the character you present on Instagram. The self is much bigger than all of that. The self is the symbolic center of totality. It's what you're called to be when you integrate all the parts, when you stop fighting with the opposites inside you and allow them to coexist, when you accept that you can be strong and fragile at the same time, that you can be rational and emotional, that you can have light and shadow, that you can contain multitudes, as the poet said. The self is like an internal compass that always knew the way, even when you were completely lost. Even when you were walking in circles, feeling more and more distant from yourself, the self was there, quiet, patient, waiting for you to finally stop following all the wrong maps and start paying attention to the only direction that matters. The problem is that we spend our entire lives listening to all the voices from outside and completely ignoring this voice from within. We follow what our parents said was the best path, what school taught was the right way to live, what society values and rewards, what friends expect, what the partner wants, what the boss demands. And in the middle of all this noise, all these external demands, all these expectations you try to balance like spinning plates on sticks, the self stays there, quiet, waiting. Not with impatience, because the self has all the time in the world, but with unwavering persistence. Like that light in the lighthouse that never goes out, even when nobody's looking. And the feeling of not belonging that you've carried for so long? That feeling of always being displaced, always out of place, always kind of foreign wherever you go? That feeling is the self nudging you, reminding you that you're far from home, far from your own inner home. If you're enjoying this content, you might also like our exclusive material that's in the first pinned comment. There's an interesting thing that happens when you start looking at myths, at ancient stories that span millennia, at archetypes that appear in completely different cultures without any contact between them. You realize that the figure of the exile appears everywhere. It's a universal human pattern. Moses, who was expelled from Egypt and spent 40 years wandering in the desert before finding the promised land. Prometheus, who was chained to a rock for stealing fire from the gods and giving it to humans. Christ, who spent 40 days in the desert, tempted and alone, before beginning his ministry. Parsifal, who was lost in the forest for years, seeking the grail he didn't know how to find. Buddha, who left the palace and wandered as a beggar before finding enlightenment under the tree. Inanna, who descended to the underworld and had to die symbolically before being reborn. All these stories, separated by centuries and continents, speak of someone who was separated, rejected, thrown out of known comfort. And you know what they all have in common too? The revelation comes after exile. Transformation happens in forced solitude. The gift appears when you're most lost. It's as if you needed to be torn from false comfort, from the illusion of superficial belonging, from the ready-made answers they gave you, to finally find something true. Something that's genuinely yours and not borrowed from anyone. So maybe, and I know this might sound strange, maybe even contradictory, but maybe the fact that you feel displaced isn't a defect. Maybe it's not a sign that something's wrong with you. Maybe it's a sign that you carry within you a symbolic destiny, that you were called to see the world from outside before you can return to it with something new, with a consciousness that's only born in exile, with a perspective you only gain when you're forced out of the current, when you stop following the automatic flow and start observing from a distance. And maybe, just maybe, what seems like a curse is actually a calling. And there's a beautiful metaphor the alchemists used that makes a lot of sense here, that illuminates this whole process in a poetic way. They talked about transforming lead into gold, and everyone thinks it was literal, that they were just a bunch of crazies obsessed with getting rich making precious metal. But Jung realized, studying alchemical texts for decades, that alchemy was actually a deeply sophisticated symbolic language to describe psychic transformation. It was a map of the inner journey disguised as a chemical recipe. Lead is the raw ego, heavy, opaque, dense. It's you trapped in your own limitations, in your own narrow beliefs about who you are and what you can be. Gold is refined consciousness, luminous, integrated, flexible. It's you having integrated the shadows, conversed with the unconscious, recognized the archetypes operating through you, and the process to go from one to the other, to transform this heavy lead into shining gold, goes through very specific phases. The negredo, which is symbolic death, the complete dissolution of everything you thought you were. The moment when the ego melts and you're left without ground, without references, without knowing who you are. The albedo, which is the clarity that comes after darkness, when you start to see things as they really are, without illusions, without filters, without masks. When light finally enters after so much time in the dark. And the rubedo, which is the final unification, the alchemical marriage, when opposites marry inside you and something new is born. When masculine and feminine, light and shadow, conscious and unconscious, finally recognize themselves as parts of the same whole. The feeling of not belonging that you've carried for years, maybe since childhood. That feeling is the first fire that initiates this alchemical work. It's the heat that starts to melt the lead. It's the discomfort that says, something's wrong here. Something needs to change. I can't continue like this anymore. And what seems like pain, what seems like crisis, what seems like you're falling apart, is actually the ferment. It's the negredo preparing you for the albedo. It's the process calling you to transformation. You're not broken, you're in the making, and every alchemical work hurts before it shines. There's a card in the tarot that always fascinated me, that carries deep symbolism about this journey. The Hermit. It's the figure of a solitary old man at the top of a snowy mountain, wearing a gray cloak, holding a lantern in his raised hand. And many people look at this card and see only isolation, sadness, abandonment, loneliness as punishment. They see someone who was left behind while others moved forward. But the Hermit isn't running from the world. He wasn't abandoned up there. He chose to climb. He withdrew temporarily, consciously, to see better. Because when you're in the middle of the crowd, in the middle of the noise, it's impossible to have perspective. You need distance to see the whole. He climbed the mountain to have a panoramic view, to understand patterns that only become clear from far away. And the lantern he carries? It doesn't illuminate everything at once. It doesn't show the complete path from beginning to end. It illuminates only a few steps ahead. Because the journey doesn't need to be all clear from the start. You only need to see the next step, and then the next, and then the next. The lantern is consciousness. It's the inner light you cultivate in silence. And there's something deeply liberating in this idea that solitude isn't a punishment. That stepping away temporarily isn't failure. Solitude can be a portal. A sacred space where, finally, the voices of the soul can be heard because there's no more external noise competing for your attention. It's in the hermit's silence, in that forced or chosen retreat, that you stop seeking validation out there and start cultivating sustenance in here. It's there that you start inhabiting the inner house with more presence, with more attention, with more reverence. It's there that you stop being a tourist in your own life and start being a resident. But look, there's a moment in the journey, and this moment is crucial, when something changes. After all the inner work, after facing the shadow without running, after deciphering dreams with patience, after going through the nigredo and starting to rebuild in the albedo, after all this solitary and often painful process, you start to realize you're not completely alone. That there are other people who also walked in darkness, who also felt exile, who also felt foreign in the world. And when you meet these people, when you look into someone's eyes and see that there's a soul that understands, without needing explanations, without needing context, without needing defenses, something happens. A recognition that's almost instantaneous. It's not about forming superficial tribes based on common interests. It's not about finding people who like the same bands as you, who vote for the same politicians, who root for the same team. It's about deep recognition. It's about soul resonance. When you authorize yourself to be whole, when you stop performing the character you think you should be, when you stop hiding the parts you judge inconvenient or problematic, you stop attracting only through the ego and start resonating through the soul. And then the encounters change in quality completely. They're no longer casual encounters, based on convenience or social utility. They're encounters that have weight, that have meaning, that seem inevitable in a way you can't explain rationally. It's as if souls recognized each other through all social layers, through all superficial differences. Two people can have completely different stories, come from opposite places, have distinct beliefs. But when both have already done the work of looking inside, when both have already faced their own shadows, when both have already passed through the alchemical fire, there's a common frequency, a shared language that needs no words. And in these encounters, finally, you feel like you belong. Not because you molded yourself to fit, not because you pretended to be someone else, but because you found those who are also whole. And wholeness recognizes wholeness. So, after all this journey, this descent and ascent, this exile and return, this long and tortuous process of losing yourself to find yourself, what remains? What do you do with all this? Because understanding intellectually is one thing, living is something completely different. And the truth is that building an inner home isn't a single event. It's not an achievement you reach, and that's it. Mission accomplished. It's a continuous practice. It's a daily cultivation. It's a commitment you renew every morning when you wake up. There are some things that can help in this process. Some symbolic practices that create bridges between the conscious and unconscious. Writing your dreams, for example. You don't need to do deep analysis every day. You don't need to be your own therapist. Just the act of recording already creates a bridge. You're telling the unconscious, I see you, I hear you, you matter. And when the unconscious feels heard, it starts speaking more clearly. Observing synchronicities, those coincidences that seem too meaningful to be chance. That book that falls from the shelf just when you were thinking about that subject. That song that plays on the radio with the exact lyrics of what you were feeling. That casual conversation that answers a question you'd been asking internally for weeks. Jung called this synchronicity, and it's not about magic or cheap mysticism. It's about paying attention to the symbolic field that surrounds us, paying attention to symbols that repeat in your life. That animal that always appears, that number you see all the time, that theme that returns in different formats. All of this is signs, messages from the unconscious trying to tell you something. Practicing active imagination, which is when you consciously dialogue with images that arise in your mind, giving voice to parts of you that rarely speak. You sit, close your eyes, and let the image that wants to come. It can be a human figure, an animal, an object, a landscape. And then you talk to that image. You ask what it wants to tell you. You listen to what it answers. It's not invention. It's not arbitrary fantasy. It's giving space for unconscious contents to manifest in a controlled way. And above all, the most important practice is developing a listening relationship with yourself. Stop judging every feeling that appears. Stop trying to fix everything immediately. Just observe. Just be present. When anger comes, you don't need to act impulsively or repress violently. You can just recognize, anger is here. When sadness appears, you don't need to seek frantic distraction or sink into it. You can just be with it. Sadness is here. Each of these practices is like placing an invisible brick in the construction of the inner home. And with time, month after month, year after year, you realize you're inhabiting a space that's genuinely yours. A space no one can take from you because it doesn't exist in the outer world. It exists within. And when the world outside gets chaotic, when things fall apart, when you lose external ground, you have internal ground. You have a home to return to that's independent of circumstances. And here's the most beautiful thing of all, the most liberating paradox I can offer you. When you finally recognize yourself, when you finally feel at home within yourself, when you've cultivated this inner home with so much dedication and care, the world out there can continue exactly as it is. Still strange, still chaotic, still full of people who won't understand you, still full of situations that will challenge you, still full of places where you technically won't fit. But you're no longer a stranger to yourself. You're no longer lost trying to fit into places that were never made for you. You're no longer spending energy trying to be understood by those who don't have ears to hear you. Because the true home isn't a geographical place where you were born or live. It's not a specific relationship that validates you. It's not an external achievement that proves your worth. The true home is a quality of presence. It's the ability to be where you are without being at war with what is. It's looking at your own reflection in the mirror and recognizing there's someone you no longer need to pretend not to be. It's waking up in the morning and knowing, even if things are difficult, even if the path isn't clear, even if you don't have answers for everything, that you're in your own company. And that this company isn't a consolation prize. It's not what's left when you can't get true connection out there. It's the foundation. It's the ground. It's the floor that sustains you regardless of what happens around you. And that, as simple as it may seem when put into words, is everything. It's what you've always been looking for without knowing how to name it. You know, I think a lot about how we spend our entire lives seeking external validation, trying to prove something to someone, trying to be enough in the eyes of those who don't even really know who you are, trying to be the perfect child your parents always wanted, trying to be the ideal partner who never disappoints, trying to be the impeccable professional who never fails, trying to be the nice person everyone likes. And in the end, after so much effort, so much performance, so much adaptation, what the soul always wanted was simply to be seen, not judged, not fixed, not improved, not transformed into something more palatable, just seen, in its totality, with its contradictions that don't resolve, with its dark parts that coexist with the luminous ones, with everything that's imperfect and deeply human. And maybe the journey of finding home, of returning to the inner dwelling, is precisely this. Learning to see yourself with the eyes you always wished others had, with genuine compassion, not with pity, with real curiosity, not with disguised judgment, with infinite patience, not with constant demand. Because when you finally manage to do this, when you finally become the home you were always looking for, when you are for yourself, the welcoming you tried to find in every relationship, in every achievement, in every external validation, something changes. Not in a magical way, not in a way that solves all of life's problems. You don't become an enlightened being floating above human difficulties. But it changes in a way that makes everything bearable, that makes even loneliness a companion, that makes even displacement a strange form of belonging, because you no longer need to fit into anything. You're already whole. There are people who will live their entire lives without ever questioning whether they're really living or just following a script someone else wrote for them. They'll spend decades following the script, doing what's expected, being who they're told to be, and will die without ever having known who they really were. And that's okay. Everyone has their time, their rhythm, their journey. You can't force anyone to wake up. But if you've made it this far, if you've read all this and felt something resonate, that something hit a frequency you already knew but had forgotten, then maybe you're already in the middle of the path. Maybe you've already realized you can't pretend anymore, that the mask is too heavy, that performing is exhausting, that living from the outside in is killing you slowly. That exile, as painful as it is teaching you something essential. And I won't lie to you saying it will get easy. It won't. The process of becoming whole, of integrating the shadows you rejected, of facing what was denied for years, of building a genuine inner home brick by brick, this process hurts. Sometimes it hurts more than staying in the illusion. Sometimes you'll want to give up and go back to the false comfort zone. Sometimes you'll look at others who don't question anything and envy their apparent simplicity. But the difference is that this pain has direction. This pain is taking you somewhere. It's not the pain of going in circles, of always hitting the same wall, of repeating the same destructive patterns. It's the pain of birth, of giving birth to yourself, of alchemical transformation that needs to pass through fire before becoming gold. And here's something I learned after a long time that might help you. You don't need to have all the answers now. You don't need to know exactly who you are, what your grand purpose is, what the ultimate meaning of all this is. These questions are important, but they don't need to be answered all at once, definitively, at 20 or 30 or 40 years old. The path reveals itself as you walk. Clarity comes with practice, not before it. You're not going to have a mystical epiphany that will solve everything suddenly. It will be a gradual process, sometimes slow, of recognizing more pieces of yourself, of integrating more parts, of building more consciousness. And meanwhile, while you're on this confusing and tortuous journey back to yourself, be kind. Be as kind to yourself as you would be to a lost child. Be patient. Because the soul doesn't operate on ego time. The soul has its own rhythm, its own seasons. And it will take you home. Maybe not in the way you imagined, maybe not in the time you'd like, maybe not by the path you planned, but it will take you. Because that's the only possible direction, the only journey truly worth taking. Back to the place you should never have left, back to yourself. So, if you're feeling displaced today, if you're wondering why you can't fit in anywhere, why everything seems out of place, why you feel like you're speaking a language nobody else understands, take a deep breath. Look inside. Recognize exile for what it really is. Not an eternal condemnation, not a sign that something's fundamentally wrong with you, but a calling. An invitation to begin the construction of the only home no one can take from you. The home that exists at the center of your own consciousness. And when you finally get there, when you finally sit in this internal space with the deep feeling that yes, this is where I belong, you'll realize it was worth every step. Every dark night staring at the ceiling unable to sleep. Every moment of loneliness that seemed unbearable. Every crisis that seemed like the end of everything. Because all of this, absolutely all of this, was bringing you home. And there's no journey more important than this one. So that's it. If this video made any sense to you, if something here touched something you'd been feeling but didn't know how to name, leave your like, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next content. And mainly, start paying attention to your dreams, to your shadows, to your synchronicities, to the symbols that appear and reappear in your life. Because the soul is speaking. It's always been speaking. You just need to start listening.